Welcome everyone to episode 51 of What's That Sound podcast. My name's Stu Watts and today I talked with Joe Carra, who is a mastering engineer and the owner of Crystal Mastering, which operates out of the northern suburbs of Melbourne. He's worked on ARIA-winning records. Some of his credits include the Teskey brothers, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Hiatus Coyote, Amel and the Sniffers, Genesis Owusu, heaps of massive records. We talk heaps about crystal mastering, what that's all about, how Joe learned mastering, first of all, as a cassette mastering engineer and as a tape op as well in the early stages of his career, and how in-person sessions are such an important part of his process these days. For all that and heaps more, stay tuned. This is a cracker episode. So much awesome information in this one. If you could do us a favor, share the podcast around in your DMs, on your socials, in person, spread the word about it. We want to share this with as many people as possible, and you can help by doing that. Make sure you're following or subscribed on the podcast platform that you like to listen to podcasts on. That way you can stay up to date with everything new in the world of What's That Sound. Heaps of cool shit coming. You know, I've been talking about it. If you have any suggestions or questions, you can send me an email, podcast.whatsthatsound@gmail.com. For any links to any of Joe's or my stuff, you can check out the show notes at your leisure. Don't do it before you've listened to the end of this podcast, of course. And anyway, let's just get into it. This is the latest episode 51 of What's That Sound podcast with my guest, Joe Carra.
You're listening to What's That Sound with your host, Stu Watts.
Welcome everyone to another episode of What's That Sound. My name's Stu Watts. Today I'm here with Joe Carra. Joe, welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thanks for having me, Stu.
It's good to have you here. We only met not long ago, but I got a project done through you in 2012, it or not.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, this is a while back, over 10 years. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But it's good to be here. And, if anyone doesn't know who you are, give us a little bit of an insight into what you do in the music industry.
Well, I pretty much just do one thing, and that's mastering, and that's what I started off doing back in the early 90s. So I started doing cassette mastering, then went into CD mastering, and then, I guess it's just called mastering these days, isn't it? We've kind of left the old CD thing out of it now. It's just mastering with streaming and everything now. And, that also encompasses, a lot of vinyl mastering, which has had a resurgence. But, so now it's just audio mastering. But that's pretty much all I've done since day one, since about 92, something like that. So, fell into it kind of a long time ago where I didn't even know what mastering was when I entered the industry. I rocked up to a studio. This was my first year after my first year of uni.
Yeah.
So not far from here, I went to La Trobe.
Yep.
They had an awesome music course there. Mm-hmm. It was really revered. It had almost like a commercial grade analog studio. They had MIDI labs. They had that was well funded. They had the best of everything. It was really good.
Yep.
Even the entrance exam was really hard to get into because it had to cull people because it was so popular. They needed to
I can imagine there wouldn't be that much back then.
Back then there wasn't. There was nothing. People were flying in from all over Australia to get into it because it was really well respected.
Yeah.
You had to sight sing for the entrance exam.
Really?
They gave you a sheet of paper and they're like, sing that. And
that's so strange.
They put a big emphasis on music theory. Yeah. And I think once again, that was a filter to get a lot of people out. Mm-hmm. And lucky I had done private music lessons since I was in primary school.
Yep.
And my teachers were always really big on music theory. And I loved music theory. A lot of people don't, but I enjoyed it as much as the playing and stuff. So I just had enough to know to get in.
Yeah, good.
And that was a great course. Had fond memories of it.
Were you playing music?
playing music, yeah, just in terms of doing my lessons and playing privately and jamming with some mates from school.
Yeah.
as you
Guitar
do.
or
No, piano.
Piano?
I started off being in a good Italian household, mate. Piano accordion.
yeah.
We had
Love
two.
it.
We had two accordions. I don't know how we ended up with two, but
Yep.
Dad had one, and I think we were the custodians of my uncles for a while.
Yep.
And so, Dad kind of said to me one day, "Hey, do you want to learn an instrument?" And I was like, "Yeah." Because he knew I'd say yes. Because I was not into my sport. I wasn't an outdoorsy kid. I was indoors, drawing, making models. I was that kid, you know.
The engineer type.
They had to drag me out to get sunlight, So when he said music, I'm like, yeah, man, I'm down with that. And so he threw an accordion at me and he said, we're going to do some lessons. And so I went to this institution in Footscray called the Troy House of Music.
Yeah.
That was around forever. So I did lessons there and got into it that way.
Yep.
And then gradually, after some years at that, probably 5 years or something, my teacher said, "Hey, do you want to learn something else?
Yeah.
There's something cooler.
Yeah.
Do you want to learn the piano?" I'm like, "Yeah, man." And I dropped it like a hot potato. I was just like a sponge. I soaked it all up.
Yep.
I'm like, just teach me, I was loving it.
Yeah. Do you remember what music you were listening to?
Yeah. So I guess a child of the 70s, it was vinyl, pretty much grew up with. So it was mainly popular music. It wasn't anything avant-garde or outstanding in my house. A lot of Elvis Presley.
Cool.
Mum and Dad loved Elvis.
Yeah.
ABBA. I remember ABBA records and a bit of popular music. Some Italian stuff, like some Neapolitan stuff, maybe even some classical Pavarotti or whatever. There was a bit of that, but I had an older sister. She was into her Euro pop and Susie Quattro. Gosh, she punished me.
Yeah.
Susie Quattro day in.
What a voice.
I could sing any song of Susie Quattro line for line. It's ingrained. In fact, let's do a song now, Stu. No.
Yeah.
No. So it was just a bit of a mixed bag, but nothing like I listen to today. Like I listen to a lot of jazz and have for some decades, but my parents hated it. We never had jazz in the house at all. Yep. And to this day, Mum will come over and she's like, "Can you turn that noise off?" She's like, she does. But I love, so fusion and jazz, that's what I like to listen to on my time out. And I mean, I listen to a pretty wide variety and through work, a massive variety of stuff. But I do like to listen to a lot of nice jazz. I just find it very appealing and interesting, and that's coming from someone who struggled to play jazz. I wanted to. I desperately wanted to improvise and play jazz, and I do terribly at it. So now I just listen to other people and just kind of go, "Yep, that's what happens when you practice for 10 hours a day for 20 years. That's how you get." So
I know.
But it would have been nice to do that. But no, I still enjoy playing. I have a piano at home these days, and I just for my own amusement. But I definitely enjoyed jamming with mates in primary school, high school, I should say, and stuff like that.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, tell us about, when you were learning, when you're at uni and stuff. Like, what did that look like? What what do you remember from that period?
I remember being daunted by it all because it was all pretty full on. Like the studio was a big analog studio, big desk, all of the trappings of a commercial studio. But I fell into it. I fell in love with it, I should say. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. That kind of coincided with my I guess my experiences with synthesis at home. So once I started learning the piano, we didn't have a piano. My parents very graciously bought me a synthesizer, which was pretty extraordinary when I look back on it because we were definitely not a rich family, just a blue-collar working family. But they supported my music education. They almost saw it like my proper education. They didn't kind of delineate that. They were like, it's music
just
education. It is. And because I went to this music school and they had a music shop there, I'd always rock up 20 minutes early and I'd go straight to the keyboard section. I was that pain in the ass kid that would be playing jump and, Final Countdown on all the keyboards.
Yeah.
And I think the staff, they were told that, hey, he's a paying customer. He's at our music
Let him
school.
do it.
Yeah, or else they would have kicked me out. Honestly, I was a pain in the ass,
That's so funny.
playing jump full ball on
Yeah,
every
yeah.
keyboard. I was just ridiculous.
Yeah, it's
but
so good.
but
But I feel like anyone listening would have a similar. Like I always used to love going into the music stores,
mate.
and for me, I was a drummer and guitarist a couple of years later. But I was always a keyboard. I was always like, oh, what does this do? Like, what sounds? Like why is this one sounding different to this one, and just not understanding it at all? Yeah.
My most embarrassing moment in life was in a music store. I was in Allen's in the city in Burke Street or something, and I wagged school. That was my treat. I went to the music store and I just chucked the headphones on, and for an hour I was smashing out stuff, playing everything, Billy Joel, this, everything, man, just doing Joe's greatest hits.
That's so good.
And I was getting some kind of weird stares from the staff during this period, but I'm like, fuck them.
It's there.
Yeah. So I just had my cans on in my own world.
Yeah.
So after, I finished that little concert, I took the headphones off, and I remember placing them on the DX7, and I heard the notes come through the internal speakers through the store. I had not realised I was serenading everyone for an hour with this stuff. And I'm like, I just ran out. I was so embarrassed. But yeah. Anyway, so my dad knew I loved keyboards, and I'd always watch Countdown and Solid Gold, and I'd always be going, oh, Dad, look, there's a Roland D50 and a DX7 and this. And, he could have bought me a Kmart special and gave me a $50 keyboard and said, do your lessons on that. But he was like, no. He knew I was pretty dedicated to it, and he just surprised me one day. We went down and he said, pick a keyboard, Joe. Go for it.
Unreal.
You're a good kid. So I'm like, okay. So I checked it all out, and I ended up with this Ensoniq SQ80 keyboard, which was
never even heard of it.
It was a fully fledged studio touring grade keyboard. It was Ensoniq made some amazing stuff. So I brought that home, and at first it was just a glorified piano. I was just playing it like an electric piano, doing my lessons. But then I got more curious about it because there was all these buttons and stuff on it, VCA, envelope, oscillator, this, that. And I'm like, what is all this stuff? So I just started playing and manipulating stuff. And the day that I realised you could change the sounds and save your own patches on this floppy disk, my little mind was blown.
You thought I was a hermit before. Check me out.
I would rush home from school on the daily and just chuck the headphones on. And I felt like I was in my own little universe. It was happy day. I was just like doing this and doing that. And I'd be calling my dad and going, you can change sounds, freaking out. And I loved synthesis. And then months later, I discovered more of the keyboard. Like there was this center bit that I never understood that said sequencer. I'm like, what is a sequencer? I never read the manual. Who reads the manual? And so then I discovered that you could record 8 tracks and edit and loop, and I'm like, I've discovered the portal into another dimension, man. This is freaking awesome. I was just like, I could not get enough of it. And I really got the bug, making sounds, sequencing, and then got a part-time job. I started buying drum machines and modules. And then when I started uni, I bought myself the first Mac Classic, the black and white version, and someone gave me some cracked software at uni, and I hooked it all up and had a MIDI studio in my bedroom. And I was a little bit of a nutty professor, and I loved it. I just loved it. You know, it was, as I said, pretty happy memories. Haven't thought about that stuff for a long time, but it was good days. You know?
I think, and with the technology back then, because it just wasn't available to you, and it wasn't like you could just look it up and learn about it. You had to go into a store, and you had to try it out. You had to just learn about it by using it. Like, you bought it. That was the commitment. It's like, can't go back now. That's the one.
And the rest was up to you, wasn't it? And you had to spend days and weeks and, months learning it and figuring it all out. And, But being at uni, doing that course, I was learning a lot about MIDI. I mean, they had Kurzweil samplers and Akai samplers and some notator software. So they were really well kitted out, and I would go home and keep practicing and doing all that stuff. And then I remember at the end of the first year, I remember the orientation kids coming through, the new kids coming through and kind of going into my class and going, so who here thinks they're going to get a job once they finish this course?
Good question.
And I was pretty shattered because all my classmates were just they laughed and sniggered at it. And I had this really naive kind of picture of it all. I just figured you go to uni, you get your papers and you get a job.
Like, why else am I here sort of thing? Yeah.
I wasn't there to fuck around. Yeah. But everyone else was just like treating it like a bit of and I was like, whoa, okay, what? And it was a bit of a light bulb moment. I'm like, Joe, you better get your shit sorted. Are you wasting time? Yeah.
Yep.
And to be honest, my mum was also, God bless her, she was on my case too. She would literally buy the Age and the Green Guide, bring it home and look through it and go, Joseph, I can't see any jobs for audio engineers in here. How are you going to make a future? She was so concerned about me.
That's so good.
And she would do this repeatedly. So between her and my classmates treating this like a joke, I'm like, okay, I'll look into it. And it was towards the very end. I'd finished my exams and I'm like, I've got my summer break. I'll see what's going on. Got the yellow pages out that night.
Yep.
Went up to the upstairs telephone to have my privacy, And I just flipped to the R section for recording studios and started. I started from A, rejected, B, C.
Yep.
And I got to D, called Dex Audio. I started to go into my spiel. I was about 20 seconds into it. And the guy's like, when can you start?
Yeah, that's sick.
And I'm like, Monday. And he's like, yep, see you then, 9 a.m.
Unreal.
And
Yeah.
I remember being pretty cocky about that phone call.
Yeah.
And I went downstairs to my parents who were cooking dinner. And I'm like, this whole career thing and job thing, I've got it sorted. Get off my case. Chill out,
See, I knew.
And they were just, my dad's giving me this wry smile of what's this guy up to, But it was, and the weird part about it is that one phone call actually set me up on a trajectory, on a path that led me to where I am, today with you. It was weird in that there was a very distinct path after that phone call from going to Dex, learning about mastering, setting up my own business, doing all that stuff. And it was just weird that it panned out that way. But it was a very fortuitous phone call and
yeah, well, I was going to say, what were you thinking of walking into there? What did you think that your, career was going to look like? Or just, you didn't know?
I had no idea about mastering. That was not even talked about at uni. That was very much a behind the scenes thing. Not like today where everyone's aware about everything. There was no internet when I started all this stuff. And it was just didn't know about it. None of my lecturers even mentioned it. I might have seen it on the back of a record cover where, and not even realised what it was. But so when I started at Dex, geez, I was stupid. I actually I even rocked up to the wrong building. I went to Newmarket, because that's part of Dex.
Yes.
But they had two buildings. So I rock up to the studio, bright-eyed and just like knocking. I was 10 to 9. I was a bit early. I'm like, I'm here.
Yeah.
And this engineer answers the door really bleary-eyed and just like looking at me. And I'm like, here, I'm just all smiles and, revved up. And I'm like, you said to come, at, 9. And he's like, still looking at me for a little bit. I don't know. And he's like, you're in the wrong building. You're in the wrong place. You've got to go down the road. It's about a Kate. And I'm like, cool.
Yeah.
So I remember, it was a hot morning. When Melbourne is like 42 degrees and even at 8:50, the sun is beating.
Yeah.
So I start a brisk walk down to the other building. And
you would have looked like a maniac when you rocked up.
Dude, I broke into a little jog here and there because I'm a stickler for punctuality, right? And I rocked up And I was in my coolest jeans and T-shirt and I looked pretty presentable, but I was a hot mess when I rocked up. I'm surprised they didn't kick me out. I probably looked like some druggie or something. I was pouring in sweat from every orifice.
So
and Steve's just looking at me going, and I'm like, I'm here for the job. I'm like, sorry, I went to the other building. And he's just laughed. He's like, okay, come and clean up and come and see me in 10. So that was hilarious. And once again, I wasn't quite sure what to I thought that I was going into a studio. So
how old were you here?
19.
Yeah.
I was 19. And so Steve walks me through what looks like kind of a factory. And I quickly work out, it's a cassette factory. I can see the little cassettes and all people working and stuff. And he goes, just take a seat here. These ladies will show you what to do and stuff. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. So I sit down and these beautiful old ladies show me what to do, and I'm part of this production line, and someone slides the cassette case over and someone puts the paper part in and I pop the cassette in and someone closes it and then goes to shrink wrapping and stuff. And I'm like, cool, they're obviously getting the studio ready for me and I'll just kind of help out for a little bit. That's fine. Anyway, so 8 hours later, I'm still packing cassettes and I'm trying to get the manager's attention and stuff occasionally. And at the end of the day, I kind of go up to him like, I said, so Steve, I'm like, so how about the studio, man? When can I? And he's like, oh, yeah, no, we'll get to that. Yeah, that's fine. And he's like, but, just come back tomorrow and we'll sort you out. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm like, obviously, let's write that day off. I'm thinking that's. But they were paying me. I literally punched in and out. They had the old clock card and I punched in and out. I'm like, okay. So I did that for a few days, no change. And every day I'm kind of having these little conversations with the manager going, I'd really love to get into the studio and stuff like that. Anyway, some days turns into weeks. I'm still kind of working in the cassette factory. And I'm slow to the party and I kind of figure out, well, I'm not too happy about what I'm doing, but I'm thinking it's better than flipping burgers. I'm in kind of the right zone. It's not exactly where I want to be, but I'm like, you know what? I needed a job. I was out of work at the time. And, being at uni, you need to have every cent you can. And I was buying too much shit with my music stuff. So I'm like, I need the work. And that hasn't stopped, by the way. And so I just ended up helping out and then gradually getting into, I did do some tape op assisting in the studio and that hooked me in. Like I remember some dude about a month after I started, there's like, you're the new guy. Have you got a car? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I need a trip to the studio. Can you help me do some tape op work? And I'm like, yeah, let's do that.
That would have felt amazing.
And I remember, like if you've been to Newmarket and you're standing in that little landing area outside the studio, you can see into the control room and the booths and the live area. And I remember seeing all the little blinking lights and the massive console and all the lights and I was hooked. Just being in that environment and feeling the sense of something's going to happen and people preparing. And I was just like, this is cool. I want to be here. And I was pretty smitten by that. That was my first love. I kind of tell my wife that I'm saying, sorry, you're my second, I was in after that. So I did a little bit of tape op work, but then got into like quality control in the cassette factory, which is a lot of listening and A-Bing the replications against the masters in the cassette room. And that was when my ears started to get a bit educated about what are you listening for? Because I think I was just passively listening up until then. But then I was instructed what to listen for, EQ response, phase response, this, that. And then I started becoming a pain in the ass after that because I'd be picking on all kinds of things, going, I think I can hear this now and that. And they're like, okay, you can let some of that stuff go, Joe. It's, because they were making high dub. Like it's like 16 times real times, dubs for the cassette masters. So I'm amazed they got the fidelity they did on cassettes. But as soon as I started to realise that I was listening to a lot and an opening came up in cassette mastering, and I was always hanging out in the cassette room anyway because when I would finish my quality control, I would often just go into the cassette mastering room, hang out, look at what they were doing, and they were working mainly from DAT back then, and they weren't allowed to leave the DAT tape in case it dropped out or glitched. And everyone, they all smoked and stuff like that. So they'd like, Joe, come and sit in, mate, because I want to go out and have a, smoke. So I'd always be in there and looking at stuff and asking questions. What are you doing with that? What are you doing? And it was a very simplified version of mastering.
Yeah.
It wasn't the intense version we know today. Back then it was one pass for side A, one pass for side B. You weren't stopping in between songs and mastering. It was all a real-time process. So it was a bit of a compromised version of mastering, but a good fundamental kind of
I was going to say
thing.
A good thing to see, to be like, well, I have an understanding of what this is now.
Yep.
You always take those sorts of things in with you into the future anyway.
Yeah. So I eventually did that, and I probably have the world's shortest career of cassette mastering because I reckon I was doing that for a few months.
Yep.
And then the winds of change swept through the industry really quickly, and the boss is like, you're out of here. You're going to CD mastering is like I think when the economics came in that to make 500 CDs cost just a fraction more than cassettes.
Yeah.
Bands were like, we want that. We want that shiny silver thing, man. That's the cool thing. And cassette manufacturing wound down quickly, but CD mastering ramped up. Like there was a long shelf of DAT tapes waiting to be mastered. And the current guy couldn't keep up with it. And they're like, you're doing the night shift. And I'm like, yep, whatever. So I'd start at like in the afternoon and work till all hours of the morning. And
just keep the production going, really.
Yeah, and it was very basic. It was very basic. My first job was to do all the back end of the day sessions. So there was a lot of back end stuff back then. It wasn't no digital workstations. It was all tape-based, digital tape-based.
Yep.
So even doing something like outputting the master took hours. And they like, can we save time with Joe doing that? So I would go in, I'd get their mastered tape, which was done on like, think of a reel-to-reel tape, but it was digital.
Yep.
So that's where they would compile all the songs during the day. That was like your hard drive.
Yeah, cool.
And then that had to be transferred onto a U-matic tape, which was like a large video tape.
Yes.
And that was the CD master. That's what they would call the 1630 master. That would go to the CD place, and they'd make a glass master from that and so forth. So I was in charge of transferring the dash tape to the U-matic, collecting all the index points where the tracks started and stopped. It was all manual. You had to scrub the reel and go, okay. And there was pressure because you'd have to write it down. If you wrote the wrong number down and they made 10,000 CDs, your ass was on the line.
And I remember with, CD sequencing, there were some albums where it's like it didn't start at the right time, and that's probably exactly what that was.
Yeah.
So like, why is the fade out still happening with the last song? Yeah.
So there was a lot of pressure to get all that basic stuff right, and so you had to do all the paperwork, and then you would have to do the error check. So you'd have to run the final tape through this error check because it was digital tape. And they didn't want any dropouts or mutes occurred. So there was an allowed number of errors or CRCs per minute. CRCs are like inaudible errors, but if it built up, they would reject it. And like literally this tractor-fed printer would print out this report at the end, and you'd have to read it all, and you'd have to check line by line that you weren't over the amount of errors per minute, or you have to circle it and stuff if it was errors, and then try to – it was a process.
But also like thinking about the word like engineer, that's totally acceptable to place that. Like these days, engineer isn't really the right term for what we do.
Mate. And then if something went wrong, it was my job to troubleshoot it. And it was a pain in the ass. Like the dash tape, the compiled tape going to the master tape, if it dropped out during that sequence, you'd have to go back to that stage and try and retransfer it and hope that dropout would self-correct.
Yes, because if it didn't, then you're like, what else? Something else is going on that you got to deep dive.
Or you'd have to hold, you were really good at this technique of holding a cotton bud against the head during that dropout period because there might have been a slight crease or something. And so you'd hope that that would correct the error. And 50% of the time it would.
Yeah.
And the other time it wouldn't correct. And you'd have to write this letter to the mastering engineer going, sorry, you've got to literally retransfer this whole tape onto another tape. So I would prep that and you'd have to remaster that song and re-record it into that section and do the, like, these days we press render.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Takes 10 seconds.
Yeah.
That whole process could take 3 to 4 hours. And if things went wrong, more. So it was laborious and I would do all of that stuff. And eventually I caught up with things and I got pretty efficient at it and I got good at it. And the bosses were like, you know what? You're caught up. Why don't you try some mastering?
Yeah.
And look, God bless them. They gave me enough rope just before I hung myself. They gave me a responsibility, which I don't think it was probably fair or due to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
But they're like, here's this tape, master it. And back then there was not that much pressure on mastering engineers.
Yeah.
So I entered the scene at a very good time where the expectation was low. So I could do, my instruction was transfer this tape onto that master tape and don't do anything unless you feel really compelled to do it.
Don't fuck it up.
Basically, So the first, for weeks, I would just do digital transfers. I'm like, I'm not doing nothing to this. I don't want to get my ass kicked. So I did that. And then one day I remember getting a really dull master going, oh, this sounds like shit, man, And I got the confidence to tap into an EQ and start to EQ it a bit. And that just developed and I got more confident. Then I started to adjust levels. I mean, that was probably before EQ, just adjusting levels from song to song. That was probably what I did very early on. But then I got more confident with EQ and tonality and compression and stuff like that. And then that just built. But I had the grace of, I guess, that period of time where I could learn easily and take baby steps. Whereas today, if you said, oh, I'm a mastering engineer, people expect
straight up
that, like that world-class kind of thing. There's no baby steps anymore. People are educated. They're aware of what mastering brings to the table. Back then, as I said, the expectations were low, but they quickly grew like into the mid and 90s and stuff like that. Then people became freaking aware, man. I remember people walking into the studio with a Blink 182 or Oasis CD and going, listen to this shit. This is how we want out.
Because Oasis was loud.
Man, that was, there were pivotal CDs, I remember, in my career where it just jacked everything up. People would walk in and I'd be like, whoa, okay, that's up there. And there were these really important stages and CDs where people just kind of used them as the measuring stick and said, this is how we want it. We don't want it any quieter than this. And, labels locked onto that, producers locked onto that. And look, mastering engineers locked onto that. Eventually there was this pressure from outside sources. So we started to almost create this pseudo kind of standard and that kind of just increased in RMS. And, at first it was, it was acceptable and then but then it became challenging. You had to kind of figure out this shit. Early on there was so much headroom to soak up. It wasn't a big deal. But then it became more of an engineering feat. Like you had to think about it. Like I had to restructure my signal path and gain structure and to really get this right because there was a certain amount of pressure and I didn't want to make stuff loud that was just loud. My thing was it's got to sound good.
Well, I remember the emphasis was on loudness as opposed to fidelity and dynamics and like it still somewhat is, but obviously it's shifted back now a lot because of streaming and stuff. But I mean, even though I wasn't in the industry back then, every time you put a CD in, you're listening to loudness. You're like, I know what number I like to set my thing at. And why is this one quieter? And it didn't necessarily matter about the dynamics or the sound of to people that cared, it did. But I think for the general listener, it was like,
my challenge for myself was I need to make stuff sound good. I just wasn't happy with the limiters they had at the day. I mean, I think the L2 was probably the mainstay for a while there. And the trick with the L2 was never to use too much. Like, I reckon if you'd used, I had this magic number, 1.4 dBs.
Yep. Okay.
I never used more than that because I could hear it. And I tried to work under that,
Yep.
you know, but every time I went over that, I'm like, I can hear it, man. Kicks and snares are suffering and dynamic. So my aim was to always just make stuff sound good and not succumb to that pressure. And I didn't want to be known as the guy that only made stuff loud. Like, I always had really encouraging comments from the producers I worked with. They're like, Joe, that's a pretty healthy level you got there. But it sounds like they would A/B it in the studio and they're like, it sounds as dynamic as the unmastered version. When they said that, that was my biggest compliment when they said, this is louder.
And you knew you were onto a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was still an evolving thing for me. I would always experiment with the way things in my chain were hooked up. And I almost treated it like that was my responsibility to do that. Just don't be a lazy engineer. Figure stuff out, change it out, swap it out. I would find putting 2 bits of gear in the opposite order would give me 1/4 of a dB more level because electronically it was a more sympathetic relationship there, you know. And all of a sudden, like, I just got an extra 1/4 dB and I didn't do anything and it's just more forgiving. Once I kind of, my brain started to wake up about that, I became quite obsessive.
Yeah, I can imagine,
with signal path, gain structure, A to D conversion. I went down that rabbit hole and I started to invest time and money, like everyone, into stuff. And I always wanted the best so I could, and I feel that using analog gear was it was very beneficial for me in that aspect alone. I mean, I believe in all aspects. I loved working with it, but just with volume wise, you know, I'd feel sorry when I'd read things on forums and people going, oh man, they do all these limiter shootouts and like, oh, I've just used this limiter at 5 and 6 dBs. What do you think? And I'd be like, no limiter sounds good when you're doing that much gain reduction. I don't care what it is. But with analog, I think it was just so much more forgiving, and I felt that I was on the right path here because I was barely using any limiting. There were some albums I used 0 limiting and I could just get the volume through my analog chain. And I feel strongly about it to this day. I feel it's a much more forgiving format to work in with mastering. And to be honest, even though things have cooled down a bit with level, there is still a certain expectation. And even though I sometimes do work in the box for certain things here and there, I do feel that analog is still very forgiving. And I think if you have a well-structured analog setup, volume becomes less of an issue. And it's nothing, I don't stress about it these days. Like, volume for me now, I find quite, well, I won't say easy because you're always thinking about it and keeping an eye on it, but it's not so much of a stress. And I feel that the quality that I do is much better for it.
I think the musicality of hardware is just there's a feeling. There's something about it. It just feels like nice, and you know, like the dynamic punch and it just feels like I'm all in the box purely for money reasons, and I've always just made do with what I've got. And you know, but when I have used hardware in the past and you know gone to mastering studios and stuff, like you can tell it just feels different.
Oh, I'm certainly not making this into a analog versus digital debate. It's not there at all. It works for me.
Yeah,
though.
absolutely.
This is the thing. Analog works for me. I get it. I think it's very good for mastering. I do a certain percentage of stuff in the box. That's more of that, you know, the reasons I do that are workflow based often, and there are certain scenarios where that makes sense to do. But on a day-to-day, when it's a normal standard session, I will probably stay out of the box and Yeah, for me, it seems like a format I get. But some people a lot of people have great success mastering in the box. And certainly, I mean, during COVID, I had to do that. I had to set up at home and do all that stuff.
Yep.
And that was a crash course in the box mastering
Yep.
because I'd always dabbled with it. I've been dabbling with plugins since the 90s and they were just so shit back then for mastering, I think anyway. I know a lot of people were using them still in production, but for mastering, I just didn't like it. So I've always kept an eye on it, kept abreast. Once again, I felt like it was my responsibility to always keep up with technology and just investigate. I never wanted to be that engineer that was just stuck in one spot and just, that's it, I know this and that. So I've always investigated digital. I mean, I was probably one of the first guys to ever have a digital EQ in Australia. I imported this $12,000 Weiss dynamic EQ. I don't think there was one in the country. But I remember Bob Ludwig and I think Bernie Grunman had said really good things about it. And I'm like, those guys were my heroes.
Yeah.
They're like, if they say it's good, I'm going to get into it. And, dynamic EQ was something they hadn't even released on any plugins and I wasn't using that. So I thought, that sounds like something cool in mastering.
Yep.
And I'm glad I was right because to this day, that box I use almost every day.
Unreal.
I think dynamic EQ is very good in a mastering sense. But what I was getting to is that I've always just kept up with plugins and stuff like that. And I think, it can be done well. As I said, during COVID, I had to discover a workflow and it was a deep dive because even though I'd played with plugins and I would use them sparingly here and there, particularly for little touch-ups or if I'd master something and go back and say, you know what, I reckon I could have used a touch more of whatever on that, but never really established this workflow from start to finish. I'd never needed to because I was all analog. And so that was a great experience to go, you know what, I don't have any clients attending. I'm at home in my jammies. I've got all this work to do. It didn't slow down for me. So I set up at home because that was the right thing to do, I felt. And I spoke to Music Victoria a lot about it too. I'm like, can I go into work? I won't have any clients or staff there. And they're like, sorry, you're non-essential. We can't permit that.
Yep.
You're risking $100,000 fine, which is coin I certainly don't have. And I'm like, okay, it seems like it's the right thing to do. And I did set up at home. And part of me also wanted to geek out. I'm like, I'm going to try this home.
Yeah, this forced learning thing.
Yeah, because I knew that this trickle effect would take me a lot longer.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I changed workstation. I'd used Sonic Solutions for like 25 years or whatever like that. I'm like, I've heard good things about Wavelab. I heard it's very plug-in friendly. So I'm like, I'm going to get into this. And I tore the Band-Aid off. And I'm like,
because it's also like, what other time would you get to do that?
It was perfect.
It's like, let's just go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I downloaded every plug-in pack, demoed everything out there. And I'm like, I'm going to get this down. And it was fun. And I still had so much work on. So I was able to use it in practical sense and really experiment and try stuff out. And that's held me in good stead for today because now I can bounce back on that and go, right, I've got my work. I'm very fascinated by plugins and I'm always checking stuff out. And, there are times where it's applicable. There are many times where I don't need it. But when it's applicable, it's really good. I mean, it was I think it was last week. I actually did an in-the-box session with some because they were like, we want you to do this album, but then we want you to master all the instrumentals. And then we've got alternate versions and this and that. And they're like, they're not ready yet. So can you just master the 10 tracks? And I'm like, oh, well, that means I've got to remaster all this stuff again. And it's going to cost so much more to remaster all this stuff. And I'm like, you know what? So in a situation like that, I'll do it in the box. I'm like, you know what? I will do this in the box for you. I mean, they loved it.
Yeah.
They didn't care. I mean, it wasn't even a conversation I had with them because they didn't even care.
Well, you still know your techniques. It's like you're still the same engineer. Yeah, exactly.
As much as I would have preferred to have done it. So I did all that because there was a lot of extra work to follow up. And I'm like, oh, this is going to take so much longer to do. So that's one scenario where I might like go, all right, and they had a limited budget, of course. Yeah. So that made sense. But, on the day-to-day basis, I do enjoy
Yep.
the analog mastering process. And once again, it's about what I'm comfortable and used to. It's not about better or worse. I just really feel that's a really nice format for me. And it's what I grew up with and
reliability
learned.
as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, thanks so much for listening so far. There is plenty more to come, so don't go anywhere. I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is made completely independently by myself with no sponsors. So if you like what you hear and you would like to show your support, you can send a donation to the PayPal link, paypal.me/whatsthatsound. The link is also in the show notes. Thanks so much for your support, and let's get back to it.
Tell us about Crystal Mastering. Tell us, how that got started and how it's expanded and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I was had been mastering, at Dex for about 5 years or something like that. And I probably should have stayed there longer. I'll be honest. I should have stayed there longer and kind of developed,
it happened the way it
deeper
happened,
roots in the industry. But I was suffering from young man syndrome. Want to make my mark on the world and I can do it better and stuff. And, very, very dangerous. That's a very dangerous period for young people, young men or women, to kind of make their mark on stuff because you have enough knowledge to get into trouble and hopefully enough to get out maybe.
Yeah.
I remember telling my old man, God rest his soul, and he's like, oh, business, man. He's like, that's tough. He's like, are you sure? He goes,
How old were you then?
I was 24.
Okay.
And
Wow.
he's like, you've got a job,
That
you're
is-
getting
that is young.
paid, you're getting you're getting a salary and super. And he's like, oh, Joe. I'm like, I reckon I want to do it, Dad.
Yeah.
So he's like, all right. Anyway, so I ended up doing it. This was 96. Started on very limited gear. I think I had one analog piece of gear in the studio. But I knew enough and just kind of, my thing was, if I do really, really good work, I'm hoping people will come back. And I kind of made this decision of, I know I can't afford a lot on marketing because back then there was no social media, internet, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Sounds so old when I say that.
Yeah, but
it's
the way it was.
And there was glossy magazines.
Yeah.
We were charging like $1,000 for a little ad and stuff like that. So I'm like, don't have the coin for that.
Yeah.
So I knew it was going to be a slow burn. I knew that it was going to take a while to get into it. But I had some backing behind me. I'd been working for some years and I was a pretty good saver. So I'm like, okay, I've got a nest egg that's going to back me up. And
you'd obviously built a lot of relationships in the 4 years that you've been there.
Yeah, I'd built relationships. And so I thought, I've probably got enough fuel in the tank here to see if this could work. I mean, it could have gone either way, but there was enough to get it off the ground. And I think, there was like a $50K investment and stuff like that. And because just the computer, just the Sonic Solutions was $24,000. So that ate up half the budget like that. That was for a 2-track editor from America.
It's mind blowing. Thinking about it now. It's crazy.
Yeah, that was the original, and that was the workstation. If you were doing anything with mastering, you had to have that pretty much. Yeah. There were some exceptions, but any mastering studio had Sonic Solutions, and it was the standard up until only seemingly a few years ago. And it was actually a byproduct of Star Wars. When they were editing Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas said to his staff, I need a non-linear digital editor. And so the Boffins made this thing.
Oh, mate.
And then they called it DroidWorks or something like that.
Yeah.
And then he gave it to them after the movie. He said, okay, it's yours.
Yeah.
And they ended up rebadging it and designing a mastering software.
Yep.
And that's what everyone used. It was the original bit of software that had no noise, declicking. So any of those any of the records in the 90s and 2000s where they would say, digitally remastered and this and that, it was all done on Sonic. There was nothing else out there. So that was the software and package that I used, and it had its own sound card, and it was all a host-based system, very expensive. So then I had a little bit of budget left, which was acoustics, monitoring, and minimal gear. I had basically zero. So every time I made some money from jobs, I would have to save a little bit of a nest egg, buy some gear. But that was a very slow approach, and I was very eager to build a studio up quicker than that. And the yearning for analog processing was still big, even though the industry was very much was going into that DIY phase, and people were digital. People yearned for that stage of analog at the mastering, and there was a big call for it. So I guess the business built a bit of traction, and then I got bite-sized loans from the bank, just enough not to get me into trouble. So I'd say, give me your smallest loan, like a $15,000 loan or something, and I'd be like, okay, well, I can buy 2 bits of good mastering gear with that, or 1 maybe. I think my mastering console was maybe one loan was like 15 grand or something. Mastering gear is just insanely expensive. It still is.
Yeah.
But so I'd pay that off in a few years, get a few born bits of gear, pay that off. And before I knew it, I had this credit history with the bank, because they're like, oh, you've paid off these 3 small loans. They might have been like 15 to 20 grand each. And I'd built up the company, and the company did it was received really well.
Yeah.
And there was a time in Melbourne where there was a big hole. Everyone was flying to 301 to get a lot of stuff mastered, going overseas, sending stuff elsewhere.
Yep.
And I think we just filled a niche in the market. And that's all I did. And I believe that was important, to focus on one thing only. And then after about 10 years in this nice but kind of humble setup in Ascot Vale, it was in a domestic kind of situation. And even though the studio was great, and we built the back of the business off that, and it sounded good, and, we mastered, ARIA award-winning stuff, and it was good, I knew there was limitations in that room. Sonically, I'd heard better rooms. I knew that it could be better. We were limited to the dimensions of a domestic building, height-wise and length-wise and stuff like that. And we did get some acoustic help and acousticians in to help with that stuff. But even they were like, it's only going to get so good in this environment. So I took the plunge in about 2006, about 10 years later, and kind of got a place in Thornbury. It had like 30-foot ceilings, and it basically was empty. And we got Peter Brown, who I think is Australia's best acoustician personally. And he's like, this is a blank canvas, Joe. We can do anything here.
Yeah, beautiful.
And he's like, I can make you the best mastering room. So it was a process and a challenge.
Yeah.
And it's not one I'd want to do. Building a studio it's a bit frightening. There's a lot to it. I mean, I loved doing it at the time. Now I look back on it and I'm like, what were you thinking? It was such a big commitment financially and everything, but it was fun. I enjoyed it. And I'm glad I built what I think is the studio of my dreams. Like, I'll never do this again. From here, it's only downsizing, So it was cool. It's a great sounding room. I've had so much good feedback over the years from engineers about how good the room sounds. And a lot of my clients use it as a home base. I mean, I had an engineer the other day who was like, man, I've just moved to Diamond Creek. I'm not really sure about my new home studio. I'm a bit nervous. Can I come down and just check it in your... And it's like, that's what I love doing that with clients, going, come, use it treat it as yours. If you need a reference place, I think all my clients know that my room is of a reference standard and they can check stuff. And so there's a lot of listening and consulting before I even do work these days. A lot of people recording in unorthodox environments, or we went to some guy's cabin
Anything
up in the
goes these
woods
days.
and
Like anything. People have got portable studios in a van, like.
So it's important that they can come back to a neutral zone and go, all right, how am I mixing in this space? And sometimes it's remote, and they'll send me something and I'll check it on their behalf and say, mate, you're on the right track, keep going. Or I might say, the bottom end is way out. You've got to rein in this and do that. So I love that consultative process that has crept into my workflow more and more over the years. Now that larger studios are being scaled down and people are working in, sometimes more compromised environments and stuff like that. I don't even like to use that word compromise, just different environments. Challenging. We'll use the word challenging. And they kind of bounce off me more for that reassurance. And I think mastering is a lot about that. It's not about twisting the dials and flipping the switches first and foremost.
Yeah.
That's part of it. I get it. And that's what people gravitate to. And that's what we eventually end up doing. And that's fun. But there is this whole thing about consulting at first, if need be. And this isn't with every job, but there's a large percentage of jobs where people just want reassurance.
Yeah.
And I have really expert engineers who mix and produce at such a high level that they could probably give mastering a good crack themselves. But it's funny that they who could do that don't. And they're like, we really value the mastering process. Even from that initial level, not so much the twisting knobs and stuff. It's like just that reassurance of, tell us, is it okay and stuff like that. And then they see it as their body of work going out there and their name's going to be on it. So they're like, why wouldn't we invest some coin on getting this mastered and getting my portfolio to sound as good as possible, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
and a lot of people don't see it like that. But it's funny, the more experienced guys, once again, who can afford to maybe not do it because the penny drops and they're like, no, this is a vital stage. And look, there's many albums that I've done better work in the consultation process or more influential work than the knob twisting. Yeah. You know, because I've called something out.
They probably don't need as much they don't need as much of that. Like, you know, you probably find you're having to work harder on the amateur mixers. Absolutely. So makes complete sense. I mean, I want to rattle off a few names because, you know, there's some huge names here of people that artists that you worked with. Teskey Brothers, King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard, Hiatus Coyote, Amel and the Sniffers, Courtney Barnett, Skeggs, Genesis Owusu. Like, this to me is the who's who of what is getting played on, you know, Triple J, especially these days. You know, what do you find working with, you know, mix engineers and artists of that caliber as opposed to some of the more amateur, you know, engineers and artists?
Attitude, it's all the same for me. Doesn't matter. Like, if I get an unknown come in or if I get someone who's doing a big name, to me, it's just the same. It's like focus, put my all into it. And if I need to consult, I'll do that first. But I love working with all of it. And some of the DIY stuff, can be so surprising. It floors me. It can be insanely good. Insanely good. Because people have the luxury of time to get things right. But when it's not, I love the process of communicating, consulting, getting something right, not rushing the process, not in a hurry to take someone's money and run. It's like, dude, you need to do this, you know, consulting and just telling them what they can improve. And this might be remote or it might be like, come in, dude, we've got to talk about some stuff. For me, it's about how can I get the best result for this client? And it might not mean me rushing into the mastering stage. It might mean me having a real heart-to-heart with them saying, look, there's some fundamental issues here, which I think you can tackle and do this. And the mastering could never have fixed this stuff. Yeah. But my comments are what's going to fix it. If you can take my advice, this is going to be so much better than me rushing into the mastering and putting some Band-Aids on. And it's going to sound better than what you walked in with. But we want something to sound really awesome. Absolutely. And for you to listen to it in 10 years' time and go, what was going on? What did that mastering dude do? What did I do? I don't want that to happen. And I think sometimes people can get deflated by that. Particularly you get a young guy come in and he's like, let's do this, Joe, let's do it. And I hear it and I'm like, dude, this is just not cooked enough yet. Yeah. We need to, and I can see it on their face. They leave the studio, they've written down some notes and I've given them some homework and they're a little bit in two minds about it. You know, because they were pretty G'd up about this is going to be kick-ass. I can't wait to put this on Instagram. Smile.
Because they've already been listening to it and going, this is the best, you know.
And then I come and kick them in the guts about it. But 100% of the time, they will call me 4 or 5 days later and they're like, dude, you were so spot on. I am so glad we didn't master that because it was just not right.
We've all been there.
And that is really rewarding. And then they come back and I have less work to do because I've fixed my freaking I'm doing myself out of a job here because, you know, I could have kind of shown off a bit, but
but like you said, it's all part of that. Like that's such an important part of what you do. Yeah.
And they're not going to go anywhere else now.
Yeah.
They're going to go, no, we want you to follow this through with your mastering and do whatever. And look, I'll always find something to do. I very rarely kind of don't know what to do. There's always enough meat on the bone for me to really get into, even if there are problems that I've solved. Just the general mastering kind of things, I will always find a way to make something sound better. And if I can't, I'll admit it and send it back and go, it sounds awesome. But that's very far and few in between. I don't often hear something and go, there is nothing I can do with this. But, you know.
Well, this is another thing with, you know, I like to ask mastering engineers specifically is like seemingly your part of the process is to frame the song in a presentable manner. You know, the mix is already there. Obviously, after you've gone through those conversations and stuff, you're just presenting it in the most ideal way to your ears, to the public, you know. And so where does creativity come into it for you?
Well, I think that all comes down to the range of work that you need to do. So if I can answer that and say there's some work that comes in, some mixes that come in that it's very close to the mark. So the creativity there is probably lower. That's more about just finessing and doing those technical mastering things that I need to do.
Yep.
But then the range goes all the way to the other end of the scale where someone's presented me with something and it's probably okay for mastering. I don't need to send it back to them and do any mix revisions, but I feel that there's a lot more scope that I can do and I can lean into it a bit more. And I have to admit, that's fun. Like I don't want everything coming in that's beautiful and silky. And some of these, I think, high-end mastering engineers, I think would shit their pants if they saw some of the stuff that I had to do. I mean, they're getting stuff from Beyonce and whatever every day. And like I'd love to get a Tony Maserati mix and just do nothing with it and charge $500 for a single. But that's not the reality in Australia. Like sometimes you have to dig deep and work, but that's fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes you lean into it and might create some saturation effect in it. I might lean into my tube gear a bit and do something. Sometimes a mix is just screaming for it. I'm like, oh my gosh, this would sound so good if they would let me do it. And so there are times where I'll do my safety master. I'll be like, okay, Joe, just master like a normal person, right? And I'll just give them, I'll present that. Well, I'll print a version of that and then I'll go, okay, now do your fun version, your Joe version. And I do that and 99% of the time the client goes, yeah, man, version 2, man. What were you thinking? Version 1 sucks.
Unreal.
And so I think you need to do that. And I don't know if every mastering engineer thinks like that, but I have had that comment a lot through my career. And I do a bit of work with some American dudes. There's a little couple of guys in Nashville that I do some work with, and they kind of were shocked, and in a good way, when I did some work for them a few years ago. They're like, yeah, the guys here, they're right into their very traditional, transparent EQ,
pristine,
quarter of a dB of this and this and that. And like that works, and you have to do that sometimes. That's no problem at all. But I leaned into a particular project for these guys, and they're like, they would never do that here. They would not lean into it like that. And they're like, we love your range.
Cool.
And you can't just be a one-trick pony. You have to take the foot on and off the gas and know when it's appropriate. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just know that it's begging for it.
Yeah.
But, you know, sometimes if I'm going to do a large project, it might be a 15-track album or something, and I feel I want to lean into it. But I feel, Joe, you kind of, you know, you're pushing it here. I might send them a sample first. I might say, hey, guys, because I will try and listen to a record the day before I do it, just as a bit of pre-production, and I'll make some notes and figure out what my game plan is, because I don't like coming in cold. Even though there is a lot of those sessions, when I can avoid coming in cold on that morning, I love knowing what I'm in for the day before. So sometimes I will stay back and do a mock-up master and say, hey, guys, this is where I'm thinking tomorrow. if it's and this is whether it's an attended or unattended session, I'm just like, please listen to this and let me know if we're landing on the same page, because I don't want to spend 8 hours printing all these mixes thinking I'm making the best thing ever, and you guys are like, this
What
guy's
is he
lost the
fucking
plot.
doing?
Yeah. So I try and do that, and that's all part of that, establishing a good communication with the client, not shocking anyone, but just keeping in comms with the client all the time about stuff. I mean, there are high touch and low touch jobs. Some jobs from engineers I work with every day, they, you know, it's a 1-word email. It's like, Joe, do your stuff. Okay, that's 3 words, you know. And they're like, and you know, they know what I'm going to do. I know what they're going to present. Bang, done. And there's other people where there's like 15 emails in a thread or 25, and it's just like a consultation. They've come. So there's a lot of contact. I like the high contact stuff, you know. It's pretty different to the lander approach, I guess.
Yeah.
But, you know, the high contact stuff develops relationships.
Yes.
It makes sure that they have this confidence and faith in you, and you build relationships that last for decades sometimes.
But like you said earlier, that's what people are looking for. They are, you know, there are some things where it's like important that you have speed and instant, like, this is good enough. You know, that's necessary sometimes. But like you said, when it comes to people that are about the craft, about sonics, about perfection, they are screaming for that sort of relationship, that they know that they can say, do your stuff, or if necessary, you can be like, I know I can have this conversation with this person that says, I need you to listen to me here. Like, here's how you need to improve what you've got.
Yes.
Because it's nearly there. You know, people love that. They need that. And same when it comes to production, same when it comes to mixing. You can't work in isolation. You can't just do it and think that it's perfect. Like, you need that back and forth in all areas of, you know, the craft.
It's a fine line of backing yourself and respecting what the client wants. And to be honest, if that doesn't come naturally, you're probably going to struggle in the whole process, whether you're mixing, mastering, recording, whatever. You need to know when to back yourself, and you need to know when to respect what the client wants. The client might come into mastering with some serious baggage from a previous session. I've seen that 1,000 times, where they're like, dude, do not over compress this, do not do this, do not. I'm like, okay, yeah, man, like whatever you want. And then I hear the mix and I'm like, oh, this needs everything that they just told me not to do.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that situation? Is it disrespectful if they've said, don't make this too dull, but I want to put more bass into it? You know, there are sometimes you get instructions that are so contrary to your instinct. You get something that's so shrill and bright and harsh, and the client's one instruction is, we really want to brighten this up and make it present. And you think, okay, it's time to have a coffee and take a breath here.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to do the opposite of what they do. And this is not out of disrespect. I'm assuming that maybe they had some bad experience last time, or maybe their monitoring is letting them down, or they're just speaking for this. Maybe their words are just general comments. You can't take, maybe they don't want you not to make it present.
And how many things have people heard on the internet? How many things have they heard on a quick Instagram reel or TikTok, and they believe that that's gospel? It's like...
99% of it's bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Okay, don't get me started.
Yeah.
My staff sends me stuff off Instagram just to piss me off, you know? I
love that.
There's one dude I follow, this European dude, he just drives me insane. He drives me nuts.
There's endless amounts of those dudes.
The 3 things you must do, the one EQ that will make every master sound good. I'm like, how the fuck can you just say that without hearing the mix? How can that? And then, I mean, look, honestly, Stu, if someone posts one more reel that shows a fab filter rolling off all the bottom end, cutting out 250 hertz, because apparently that's really bad for masters, and boosting 5K, like if someone posts one more clip of that saying that's what you have to put on every mix, I'm going to chuck in my own mouth. I swear. I mean, the amount of times I've boosted 250 on a master to make it warm. And I mean, you can't say that bullshit. You cannot say those things about anything unless everything is bespoke, custom, and it's got to be approached in that way. And now I've forgotten the question you even asked me.
I have too, but that's all good. I want to move into kind of what, you know, what it looks like moving forward for you. You know, what are the next 6, 12 months look like? Has it changed? Oh, you know, obviously you said COVID changed things a lot. You know, what does it look like?
Things are getting back to normal. I noticed that definitely coming back from COVID, there was a massive decline in attended sessions. I thought, oh, is this it? Because I'm used to a lot of attended sessions. Historically, I was always doing attended sessions because people literally had to come with the physical tape, whether it was DAT, half-inch, quarter-inch. So people physically had to come and drop that off and they would sit in. My, 5 band members attending with an A&R person and the producer and stuff like that breathing down your neck. For me, that was normal. Yeah. Even though that has peeled off over the years. That was big during the earlier days, I guess. But then often 2 or 3 people would attend and then COVID would come and then it just seemed to all fall away. I mean, I always did a complement of unattended sessions. I won't say that every day people rocked up, but there was always a healthy amount. And then it really dropped off. I almost mastered unattended for, it felt like almost 2 years. But this year, I'm really glad that it kind of was on the uptick again and people started attending.
Yep.
And I really like touching base with clients and having a human around and speaking to people. And I know there's a lot of pushback against that. I know a lot of people got very comfortable in working in their own space, waking up in their jammies and just doing what they had to do. I get it. Yeah. I get it, man, you know.
Yep.
But I'll be honest, I think that I hear mastering engineers say that they don't hold attended sessions and some saying they charge more to discourage it. I'm like, honestly, I think that's a big mistake. Like having clients in your space is not an inconvenience. That's a good thing for business.
Absolutely.
Building relationships is we are in the people business.
Yep.
We're in the service industry.
Yep.
And we're making art with people. We're helping them make their art. Having communication and a personal connection is by no means a disadvantage to your business. I know it's so comfy to work in your workstation on your own and stuff like that. And trust me, you'll get enough of that. I get enough of that. You know, I get a lot of unattended sessions still, but you really do need to open up your space. And if you're not comfortable with that, I think you really need to reappraise it and understand why people like working with other people. And I think collaboration is freaking awesome. And the best projects I've ever been involved with have been collaborations between mixing engineers, producers, tracking engineers, mastering engineers. They have always been the most successful and the most rewarding, and I reckon the better sounding. And that's not to say that the singer-songwriter type can't spend 3 years at home in their home studio making a work of art. I've mastered plenty of those. I often think, though, that that's the exception to the rule. I think people that can do that whole thing by themselves and come up with an A-grade product is often the exception. And the better projects I've been involved with are when these kinds of people have maybe tracked it all and mixed it to their best ability, but then involved a mix engineer to follow it through. I encourage that with all my clients. I'm like, take it as far as you can if you want, but then involve a producer or an engineer. And the money you spent with them, even if you give them a couple of days to work on your album to polish your mixes up, ideally you'd want more. I try and encourage people to do more. And I will certainly refer people to engineers too. Like if someone comes in to me and it's not really at a point where I can just give a few tips and they can go away and do it themselves, I guess my session might look like a STEM job, which I try not to do a lot of, I'll be honest, because that really does breach mixing and mastering. But occasionally I'll go, you know what? I reckon I can get this over the line. I might have sent the client back with some instructions and they've come back and not done what I've said. And I'm like, I don't think they quite have the understanding or skill set, so I'm going to help them out. And it could be as simple as you give me the instrumental and vocal because they just haven't bedded it in right. They don't, it's too varied. It's not in the pocket. It's all that stuff. So I might help them out, or I might refer them to an engineer that's really good at that style of music and do that. But I think what I'm saying is collaboration, I think, is super important. I think it yields great results.
Yep.
And I always try and encourage it as much as possible. And I think people who are afraid of being face-to-face with clients need to think about that and try and work on it.
Yeah.
A
I
lot.
think probably the exposure to it is what's needed. And it's probably just due to a lack of that and not understanding what it can actually bring to the table. So, yeah, 100%. We're going to start to wrap it up.
No worries.
Last thing I love to do with everyone is to just get your 2 best bits of advice for people in the first 5 years. First of all, because you're a mastering engineers, and then secondly, for any artists that might be listening in.
Well, I guess my advice to engineers would be general, whether it's mixing or mastering. It's probably nothing specific, but it's more of, just I would think about niching if I was going into the engineering side of things, production. I think that's really important to give a very distinct message. If you're mastering, tell people that you're mastering. I'm a big believer in it, and it was something I intentionally did when I started. I didn't want to do anything else, and I had good advice from some business people that I spoke to, people, friends, family, colleagues that I knew, and they're just like, just do one thing, Joe, and do it really, really well. Because I was still undecided at some point what I wanted to do, because mixing and recording always appealed to me very much. But these days I see a lot of people's social media and websites, and I find it really confusing what they do. There's this typical moniker throughout the industry, Australia and internationally, where you'll see recording, mixing, mastering, production, all in one. And I get the catchphrase, and I get it. And it's people are trying to catch all and get as much work as they can. I actually think they're doing themselves a disservice, because if I want someone to work with me, I'm often looking for a very specific task. And I think that's a very confusing branding style to give. And I'm not saying not doing any of those things in the background. I'm not saying that at all. But if I was a mixing engineer and I loved punk, I would be called punk mixing.
Yeah.
No,
I know what you mean. No, yeah, absolutely.
That's what I would be putting out there. Or it would be Joe Carra, punk mixing engineer. So I would make it so fucking clear what I did without any exception. So if you were a rapper and I didn't want to work with rap, you would not call me. You would go to the next person. But if you're a punk band, you'd like, fuck, dude, this is a punk guy. This is and I think everyone makes the mistake of clouding it up. Now, if you want to do a bit of other things on the side, if you do podcasting, if you do a bit of mastering, do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I just wouldn't advertise it. I wouldn't put it in my branding. I would actually, think about liaising with other specialists who do that to make your work sound better in terms of whether it be production, mixing, whether it be mastering. If you wanted to do one thing, just do it really well. But I find the common theme to most people's branding is very cluttered, confused, and indirect, and the wider community doesn't know what they really do. I mean, if I'm Googling someone and I want someone to do a hip-hop album, I'll be Googling hip-hop producer. Now, if you like hip-hop production and that's what you do, but your branding is mixing, mastering, production, podcasting, but it's just fucking so confusing. Once again, I'm not saying don't diversify or do anything, but I think your business will be better off if you focus. And I know the guys that I work with, producers and they specialize in metal or hip hop or this or that. That's what they're known for. And they have a great reputation at that. And it's such a clear goal in the industry. It's a clear message they're sending out that they fall into that work because people know them as
absolutely.
that,
Absolutely.
A shout out to, Dr. Mike, typical, he's one guy that I love what he does. He's metal. How you would not confuse what Mike does with anything else.
Yeah.
He does that, know. And I've got a bunch of clients who are like that. They're just very clear in what they do, and they get that work. And I think it develops a really healthy culture within their client base and the community at large. So that would be my advice for any young engineer coming up. Figure out what you want to do, then lock onto it. If people are asking you to do a certain thing and you find they're repeating that over and over again, maybe that's your call. I've learnt a lot from clients. You can learn a lot from your clients. Even within mastering myself, the feedback I get from clients, I've grown immeasurably as an engineer by listening to that feedback. So I would niche down. I would specialize in what I would want to do. I would also try and have some kind of security. If I was starting within my first 5 years, I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket. And what I mean by that is growing into an audio career doesn't have to be all or nothing. Like, it doesn't matter if you're working on another job unrelated to audio and slowly building that up. I've known many an engineer who have set up a studio and sit there 4 days out of the week, hoping for the phone to ring and then getting really deluded by it. But I've got a really healthy amount of clients who were just working other jobs and building up their audio on the side. And with that confidence they had that they were getting money, it instills confidence in their clients and the rest of their life, because they're not so stressed about their work anymore. They're not that silent person in the room thinking, why aren't people get another job, do something and build it up. And before you know it, the scales will tip in your balance and you're like, I've got to let go of this other job. This is so big. So building up your career, you don't have to go all in hard straight away. Obviously, the time that you do dedicate to it, you have to do well. And that's the other thing. I think I can't give advice to artists because I wouldn't dare do that, because that's just such another kettle of fish. But I'll steal their advice tip and say, with an audio engineer, I would say get both aspects right. Your technical skills have to be awesome, have to be fucking great, because there's too much competition locally and internationally. If you're not giving a great product, forget about it. But that must be balanced up with great customer service and a great business sense in terms of what you're how you're delivering that service. And people get that really lopsided. You can't have one without the other. You could have been an asshole, like back in the 80s and 90s and stuff. Right? There weren't many people doing it. And there were some asshole engineers. There really were. But people flocked to them because there weren't many people running 120 channel SSL and running a console and knowing how to produce an album. So you could do what you wanted. These days, that's different. You have to have a good bedside manner, know how to treat people well. But you can't have that either. You can't just have great customer service without the skill, right? So you have to have a really good balance. And I think you need to be aware of that. And if you think that you're weak on the customer service side of things, I think you need to work on that. Maybe seek advice, ask people.
Ask for feedback, absolutely.
Oh, feedback is awesome. And it can be from colleagues. It can be from, you have to be open to receiving that from, whether it's friends, family, colleagues, clients, people that you work with. Just you'll ask client, just say, hey, by the way, can you rate me? And just say, how did you feel working with me? And if there's a common theme coming up, if people are like, dude, I loved your work, but fuck, you took 3 days to answer every email. That's kind of almost tipped me off using you again. Fix that. And if you get other issues like that, fix it until everything is ticked off and you are humming along. And even if you need an effing list next to you to make sure that I finish this job, make sure I do this, and that. And it will become second nature to you, But you need to really have those two things working in harmony all the time.
Unreal, mate. This has been fantastic. So much knowledge in one chat with you. I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours, but really appreciate you being here. Stu. For anyone that wants to check out Joe's stuff, I'll have links in the show notes. You can reach him via his website. Thanks again, and thanks to you for checking the podcast out. do all the usual stuff. Really helps if you can share the podcast around, spread the word about it. Want to get this out to as many people as possible so that they can hear some amazing knowledge like from people like Joe and all the other amazing guests that I've had. And make sure you subscribed or followed on the podcast platform that you check this out so you can stay up to date. Got some cool shit coming. You will see. I've been talking about it for ages, but it's happening in the background. Thank you for checking this out, and we will see you next time on What's That Sound podcast.
Thanks for listening to What's That Sound. Make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcast platform to stay up to date with each new episode. We'll catch you next time.